Welcome back into the Dynasty Nerds YouTube page. My name is Garrett Price, and I have an amazing guest with me right now to discuss this really fascinating, really interesting wide receiver class on the whole, and that's Mr. Scott Barrett. You can find him on Twitter at at Scott Barrett DFB. I put your first name and last name and just made it one thing.
Yeah,
But Scott, how you doing?
Joe Dolan does that to me. Bot Scarrett. I'm doing good, man. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to chop it up with you. I think this is an interesting class. I think we're gonna have naturally both of us have some hot takes here, so I'm excited to dig into it with you.
Sweet. Well, let's quickly touch on the top three in this class. Most of this video is going to be about everything that happens afterward. But you come at things, I mean, you're known in the community as one of the leading analytical minds as far as how we look at prospects, both from a redraft, betting, dynasty perspective. You do a fantastic job with that. At Dynasty Nerds, we tend to do a lot more film grading, and sometimes our numbers and evaluation marry perfectly. And other times they look a little bit different. But I think for the most part, analytics and film are pretty set on some order of Harrison, Neighbors, and Odunze being the top three guys. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. I was telling you before the show, I don't ever remember a year where the analytics versus the film or, the mock draft people going off of their projected draft capital were so misaligned. Really just stands out. But we're all in agreement on the top three. I have it Marvin Harrison Jr. 1, Malik Neighbors 2, Rome Odunze 3. And if anyone wants to mix up that order, I wouldn't get too mad at them for that. Really feel good about those big three in a tier unto themselves. All well worth an early round one pick. After that, to me, it gets really muddied, where I don't have another wide receiver with a round one grade analytically. And to me, it just feels like a massive deep tier where they all have their own unique warts and red flags. And bust risk is pretty high for some of the players with a lower bust risk. Their ceiling's low. And it's a tricky class. Yeah, but the top three, I want to be trading into that tier. And then beyond that, maybe acquire extra round 3 picks to throw some darts on the players the analytics who think are underrated, but love the big three. They definitely live up to the hype.
Yeah, I totally agree. So let's jump from the top three to a guy that I think is, it's tough to say consensus because I don't feel like there's any consensus 4 through about 15 or so. But the name that I see coming up the most as the wide receiver 4 is probably Brian Thomas Jr. Now, talking with you, shooting back and forth some DMs on our rankings and stuff, even though we see some guys differently, this is one that we actually see fairly similar. Now, I think it's because I'm a little different than maybe the rest of the tape community. I know the tape community overall has this guy a little bit higher in Brian Thomas Jr. than I do. But what are your thoughts from an analytical perspective on him?
Yeah, he was ultimately my wide receiver 4, but I didn't feel great about that. There was quite a bit of hedging to projected draft capital and Brett Whitefield's film score. Well, I did feel good about it just because, again, I don't really like this tier, but I had a bunch of concerns. One of which was that he was just a one-year wonder playing with a top 3 projected draft pick and Jaden Daniels, who won the Heisman. Before that, he was always the wide receiver 3 by routes run per game and the wide receiver 5 by yards per game. So really underwhelming up until this last season. And even within this last season, he was very much a one-trick pony. 43% of his receiving yards came on just one route, the go route. And that doesn't even include double moves like the hitch and go, which might include the go route. That's an insane number. And you take that off, Malik Neighbors is still over 120 yards per game, whereas Brian Thomas Jr. is well below. Sure, I think he was 45 yards per game. Sure, he led the FBS in touchdowns. That's sick, but he didn't really crush by yards per route run either. ranked pretty poorly by first downs per route run. So he like profiles as really just this elite deep threat, which he was. Best ever season in PFF college history by yards per deep target. But like when you think about names like this, you think about the Will Fullers, the Torrey Smiths, the Brandon Cooks of the world. What is that? It's a bunch of players who are better at real football than they are at fantasy football. So it could be the case where he gets this insane top 15 wide receiver 4 projected draft capital, but he doesn't live up to that hype from a fantasy perspective.
And that's one of the issues that I have with a few guys that we're going to talk about in this tier, where guys that to me profile not necessarily as an X receiver and not necessarily as an elite slot guy, but more of this Z receiver, which typically is the number 2 or number 3 option in the offense. And they are this big play threat that are going to play on the outside, and they'll have games where they get 2 and maybe even 3 touchdowns, but then they'll have several games where it's 2 catches for 31 yards and that's it, and that's going to be the issue for me in a day and time where we are seeing so much cover 2 defense, where NFL defenses are really concerned with taking away some of those big plays. And we're even seeing the best of the best adjusting, like Pat Mahomes, who had, such a low ADOT for his receivers this past year. And he's dinking and dunking more than ever, but he's still an elite quarterback because he's taking what the defense is giving him. Right now, defenses just aren't giving up that big play. They're now not allowing guys to beat him deep. And so for a guy that profiles is somewhat of a one-trick pony for me. When watching his tape, I thought his hands were okay. I shouldn't even say okay. I thought his hands were good. I thought he had good hands. But when it came to contested catch situations, they crumbled a little bit more. It was, yes, he caught the passes he needed to catch, but when things got jammed up a little bit, we saw a few more drops, not being as physical as you would want from a guy that would be a contested catch guy, not very physical. So it doesn't really profile as that. It's really just this, I'm going to go long. Those are the routes that I do well. And then some of the underneath stuff, I know that there are guys that are projecting him to get better at route running, which I think is a possibility. He does have a decent ability to be able to sink his hips at times, but it's very inconsistent. So yes, maybe he develops in that. Maybe he grows in that. But to draft a guy as early as we're going to have to draft him in our dynasty drafts, and for NFL teams, as early as they're going to have to draft him, for a guy that looks more like a project than he does this finished product like a lot of the guys before him, it does scare me quite a bit. So for me, I currently have Brian Thomas Jr. at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have him at wide receiver 10 right now, which I know is well below consensus, but I do have some real concerns about him.
Yeah, I think PFF Sam or PFF Steve has him like wide receiver 21. So you're not the only one who's super low.
Okay, I'm not crazy.
You said 2 things that I thought were really interesting. Loved your point about the rise of cover 2 and teams shutting down the deep ball. And so we know that's not really a super valuable skill set in fantasy, especially in a start-sit league as opposed to best ball. And then maybe just in this day and age, we should devalue it further. The other thing you mentioned was wide receiver 1 upside. Yeah, so I see the big 3 as guaranteed wide receiver 1s. And then after that, I just see a whole bunch of wide receiver 2s and wide receiver 3s. If you ask me to who has the best wide receiver 1 potential after the big 3, we're talking about like Xavier Legette and Johnny Wilson, and like maybe Lad McConkey can be, a PPR cheat code wide receiver 1 or whatever, but it's like, sure. I don't see it with Brian Thomas. I don't see it with Xavier Worthy, Troy Franklin due to BMI issues. I don't see it with a bunch of these other names either. Just not enough production or efficiency or size or athleticism.
I get you. So let's go from what is consensus-ish wide receiver 4 to the guy that I have at wide receiver 4. And I'll be honest, I just did a video with D-Bro talking about this player. And even though he is my wide receiver 4, that leans heavily into the tape in the early part of my process. It's not the only part, but that's the heaviest part at this point, Now we'll see draft capital and landing spot. We'll know a lot more in a few days here once the NFL draft happens. But I currently have Adonai Mitchell this high, and this was what sparked our initial conversation because I am somebody, when I watched his tape, I came away looking at his skill set, the speed that he has, the ability to go up and get the football, the ability to track, which is, I think, a really underrated characteristic of wide receivers, which basically says, hey, when the ball's in the air, how do you adjust your flight path? How do you accelerate, decelerate? How do you put your body in the right situation, in the right position, whether you have to contort it, jump, whatever you have to do to be able to be in the best spot to catch the football. I think he does that one of the best. Actually, I have him with the highest score in that specific area in this class. So lots of things that I really, really liked. However, I know two things that scare the crap out of me. One, watching his tape, sometimes he did seem a little unaware of things that were going on and maybe took some plays off, which Worthy did that too. That was a little bit of a Texas thing. And, so I'm not going to put too much stock into that. But his analytical profile, which I'm sure you're about to tell me about, is doo-doo butter. I mean, it's bad. It's not good. So how scared should I be from your perspective having Adonai this high?
Yeah, I think you should be really scared. He had his profile looks the least like a round one caliber wide receiver of any round one wide receiver in at least a decade. He best ever season by yards per route run, ranked like 109th, third best on the team. By yards after the catch per reception, which is really predictive, he ranks dead last in the class. Best season by yards per game, ranks worst of any round one wide receiver in at least a decade. And then you look at like the bottom 15 on that list, it's Calvin Ridley plus the 14 biggest busts. The analytics are horrible. He's like bottom left of every graph I've seen this offseason. And it just begs this or raises this massive question from like the Moneyball quote, where it's like, if he's so good at football, why wasn't he good at football? At least analytically in college. And so there are a number of excuses you can make here. You could say, well, he's a projection. The athleticism is off the charts. Legitimately rare, unique, top 5 percentile athleticism. You can say the numbers are obscured by multiple things. He had really tough target competition last year. The year before that, he was dealing with a high ankle sprain for 14 weeks. Over those 14 weeks, he only ran 14 total routes. And so that makes him look worse. It's not his fault. He was injured, right? So like that makes all of the analytics look worse. Although that's also a red flag to me, is like, why are you out 14 weeks with a 4 to 6 week injury? The more I dug in, the more red flag. But and he transferred too. So, like maybe it's not shocking. He underwhelmed last year, his first year in the Texas system, because it was unfamiliar to him. I don't know. To me, I just didn't find all that compelling, but I am an analytics guy. So the questions I would ask you is like, why wasn't there much production if he is going to be the fourth best wide receiver in this class?
Yeah. And I think the other thing that I will say is, one, you look at, and PFF, I know, tracked this, Xavier Worthy and Adonai Mitchell both had some of the most uncatchable passes in this class. Quinn Ewers and Malik Murphy, whoever was in there at the time, just garbage throws, Steve. Mm-hmm. A lot of really bad throws. And so sometimes you would have to see some miraculous catches just for them to make a play because of how bad some of the passes were. You look at, obviously he has the first round guy in Worthy, but even his time in Georgia, Pickens was there during his freshman season. You had McConkey, you had Bowers, you had Burton there for a time being. So a lot of really talented other players around him. But the one thing that I look at in his analytical profile, and I looking at the numbers, the only thing that is the smallest sliver of saving grace is the guy seemed to score touchdowns. He did. He seemed to score touchdowns, especially you look in his biggest games. All 5 of his playoff games, he caught a touchdown. Even in his freshman season, he caught 2 in both, one in each of the playoff games. He had 11 this year, which was nearly half of the Texas touchdowns. So he did seem to find the red zone and or I should say the end zone one way or another, by hook or by crook. So it's not to say that the analytics aren't still terrible. They are. And I'm going to have to wrestle with that this entire time. Once I see where the draft capital is, what team he goes to, I'm going to have to wrestle with that. But I loved the tape. I loved what I saw as far as the combine goes. And I think I'm going to love the draft capital. So those things, but I have to then wait. It pulls him down with the production. So I'm still wrestling with it, to be 100% honest. But off of the tape, I did really like what I saw.
Well, I admire how bold you are and your confidence, and you made a compelling argument. So I hope he gets that for you, that round 1 draft capital, and it seems like he will.
I appreciate that. I hope so too. All right. So I know that we talked before, Brian Thomas we were going to agree on, and Adonai Mitchell we were not. Curious your thoughts, though, on another guy that is in the same kind of top of that next tier range when a lot of people are talking. What are your thoughts on Troy Franklin? Because I struggle with him, and this was the video that Debro and I did. It was basically Adonai Mitchell versus Troy Franklin, and obviously, as we just talked, Adonai Mitchell was my guy. But I have some real concerns tape-wise for a Troy Franklin. I didn't love everything I saw. In fact, he's below Brian Thomas Jr. for me. I have Franklin at 12. What are you seeing as far as he goes?
Yeah, so the analytics are incredible, kind of popping in all of the most predictive metrics we have. The big red flag I had on him was the same as for Xavier Worthy, which is the low BMI. In addition to that, really poor athleticism. I think he had the slowest 10-yard split of any wide receiver in the class, despite really good AI tracking. He did say he dealt with the flu at the combine. And then he showed up at his pro day like 8 pounds heavier, but he didn't rerun or retest. And so that's a concern. In like wrapping it all together, what I wrote up in my article was like, for better or worse, he's gonna be this year's Marvin Mims. I was like a big Marvin Mims guy last year, but it's like kind of the same thing. And like, I don't know if that's true or not, but it's just analytics off the charts, but you worry about the BMI. And I could go like super in depth on the BMI thing. I think I had like 5,000 words in the footnotes of Worthy's section on that. But yeah, I mean, like there's arguments to be made that he offers more than Marvin Mims, like third best in the class or fourth best by first downs per route run. Marvin Mims was a lot lower, more of just a pure explosive play guy. Really good at press coverage, although I was told I don't know that I should trust PFF's numbers on that. But yeah, different things to make you kind of feel encouraged and overcome the BMI and other concerns. But I'm eager to hear what you have to say.
So it's funny you mentioned the 10-yard split, because before I go into watching tape, I do my best to not look at the numbers. As far as their testing numbers go, because I want to see how do these things translate to the field. Some guys test much better than they actually play, and some guys do the opposite. And so I try my best not to look at all those things. Obviously, some of them stick in my head from watching the combine and whatnot. But so I'm watching Troy Franklin, and I'm watching him run his routes. And first of all, I did have concerns on some of his routes. He wasn't somebody that did a lot of the flat routes very well. And he seemed kind of slow in some of them. And I was kind of surprised in that, because I'm looking and I'm watching him and I was like, I mean, he makes big plays, but yet I'm seeing in a lot of his route running things, there's this odd slowdown that I'm having trouble reconciling. And so I went and I was like, well, yeah, 4.41 is not elite, but it's not slow at all. So, maybe I'm off on that. Maybe I'm seeing something weird. This is a subjective exercise. Maybe I need to come back another day and look. But then I saw the 10-yard split, and I saw the worst in the class at 1.61. And that explained a lot for me. When you're somebody that doesn't have the physicality, the contested catchability, those things like that, you're somebody that needs to operate well in small spaces. And I don't think he operates well in small spaces. I think he is, once again, another guy that profiles as a good deep threat because eventually he is just faster than a lot of players. But that initial get off or the initial break in his routes is usually not that quick. And so he's going to have to win on those deep post routes, those seam routes, those things like that, because I don't think he's going to do well in the middle of the field. He did have some drops and things like that as well. I'm not overly concerned about drops, but it's this lack of burst for a player that I think really needs burst in his game. That's what concerns me.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's a big concern. There's this great like Bill Belichick quote from like 9 years ago where he's like, that's where speed really matters with wide receivers is getting off the line of scrimmage initially in your route. I mean, like his track record on wide receivers is terrible, but I've always remembered that. And he might be right. Maybe he just was bad at scouting them beyond that. But yeah, I'm with you. Like that's the concern. I've flipped back and forth between Worthy and Franklin multiple times in my head, and I might still change it before the draft. That's when I'm not allowing myself to edit any further.
I get you, man. I get you. Let's touch on a couple more guys. I could probably talk to you for hours and hours, but I don't want to keep you all day. But Lad McConkey, what are your thoughts on McConkey? Currently, I have him as my wide receiver 5. There are things that I like in his game, but the lack of production, is there a good way to explain that? Or is it just truly it's a little sketchy from that type of profile?
Well, he dealt with multiple injuries over the last 2 seasons. That's kind of the excuse you have to make. I mean, if you throw out games where he had a reduced route share and, was still dealing with injuries, there's this like 4-game stretch where he averaged like 4.45 yards per route run, 92.3 yards per game. But still, like, bottom line is he had 2 100-yard games in his career. Brock Bowers missed one of those games, and like Bowers just like smashes him analytically despite being a tight end, to the point where like if Bowers was a wide receiver, you'd want to take him multiple tiers ahead of McConkey. But end of the day, McConkey crushed in all of the per target, per route efficiency metrics that my model really cares about. So he checked in as wide receiver 5 for me, with the caveat being like, analytically, he looks very similar to Puka Nacua, who, crushed the, like his per route, per target stuff across his career was better than any other wide receiver in this year's class. It was just that he was never a full-time player, always capped at like a 60% route share. And so I don't know that like that hit with Puka. I don't know that we need to be betting on that with Lad, and like that's not a red flag. But ultimately, he crushed the per route, per target stuff so thoroughly. I did feel good about him as my wide receiver 5, and I like his PPR cheat code potential, even if he doesn't have the size to really be a true wide receiver 1.
Yeah, we're in a similar boat. I have him at wide receiver 5 as well. You touched on Worthy, and so I think I know the direction you're going on him. So we don't need to spend a ton of time there. What about Xavier Legette? A guy that he's an older player, really had almost no production, like literally almost no production until his last year, and then was an absolute monster. Just crushed that last year. What are you doing with a guy like that?
Yeah, so I ended up liking him just because like
I did too.
I struggled with this, deep second tier, but like I saw enough upside there where so analytically 1-year wonders, late breakouts, the track record is horrible, where like it basically doesn't even matter how massively awesome your breakout year is. If you're 23 years old feasting against cornerbacks at the tail end of puberty, it just like doesn't matter, right? But this season was so incredible. 5th best in yards per route run, crushed in a lot of the metrics my model really cares about. And then on top of that, absolute freak athlete, really rare and incredible athleticism that I ended up getting excited about him. Like I said, after the big 3, it's really hard to find players with wide receiver 1 upside. And I think he has it. I mean, there's definitely concerns. There's definitely some warts, but I had him, like, I don't know, wide receiver 12 maybe, but like liked him maybe a little bit more than that ranking. And like, I wouldn't be shocked if he finds a way into the tail end of round 1, early round 2.
No, I could see that as well. And I was prepared to not like him. Like, I try my best to have a clear mind going into watching these guys, but I'm like, I'm thinking the same type of thing. These guys never pan out. These 1-year wonders this late, like, these guys just never are anything. I don't know. We'll see what happens. And I turned on the film, and I was really genuinely surprised how much I liked his film. Now, he has some work to do with his release and with his route running. Those are two things that need to improve at the next level. But it makes sense. He was a college quarterback, and he missed some time in college then, and he had a coaching change. Like, there were just a lot of weird things. His parents passed away at the end of his high school career. Like, just a lot of weird stuff and unfortunate things happened to him. But everything that I heard from some of the coaches' quotes were, like, he was the example that they always used in the locker room. Like, work hard like this guy, and good things will happen. And, you know, it wasn't until the end of his 4th year where it finally clicked for him and everything came together, and he was the guy that we saw this past year. But like I said, I didn't love his route running and his release, but literally everything else, my numbers, because I give numerical grades to hands, contested catch, body control, physicality, like all these things. Everything else, as 6 is an average for me, everything else is a 7 to an 8.5. Like, all of them are really high numbers for him. So he came in at my wide receiver 7, and it's another one that does scare me a little bit, but the tape is the tape for me. And man, I walked away really impressed.
Yeah. So I didn't find the excuses that compelling. So he was a senior, a quarterback as a high school senior, which is like the exact same thing for McConkey, and actually I think a few other wide receivers in this class in the day 3 range. To me, it was just like how incredible this season was. He had 4 times as many receiving yards as the next closest Gamecock receiver, and he averaged 12.9 yards per target, 4th best in the Power 5. When targeting any other or all other receivers, Spencer Rattler averages 6.5 yards per attempt. Like, that is insane. When you are the only player defenses need to focus on, and you're that efficient, you're that productive, it's incredible. And I will say, I watched this tape. I loved his tape. I've been pushing Brett Whitefield to go back to this. He did this for a time, called it a 3-play scouting or 5-play scouting, where you just like break down a player just on 5 clips and that's it. But it's like, if you just took his 5 highlights from last year, I think they beat out any other wide receiver in this class. I don't know that Marvin Harrison Jr. had any 2 highlights as good as Legette's top 5. Were just like incredible wow plays. So I'm with you. I like the tape as well. And this is a player I feel like I'm higher on than most in the analytics community.
Love it. Love it. Well, there's other guys that we could have in this category, other guys that are good names for me, and we don't have to touch on all of them, but I'm curious if there's 1 or 2 that stick out for you. Jermaine Burton, Ricky Pearsall, Malik Washington, Roman Wilson, any of those guys kind of stick out for you as guys that you particularly like or don't like?
Yeah, 2 questions. We can run a little bit late if need be. I love where you have Malik Washington over Malachi Corley, because to me, it's just like Corley's supposed to go a full round above Washington, but like Washington looks better than Corley by like 1 or 2 full rounds. Agree. So that never made much sense to me. And the other one is just a question. It's Johnny Wilson. I see you have him absolutely buried here. And
I do.
My big concern with him, same with Keon Coleman, was separation concerns. His career, or his contested target rate in each of the last 2 years was like super red flag, crimson red flag levels, where like no one hits when you're at that level. But Keon Coleman was there too, so like maybe quarterback play had a concern. But anyway, you just throw that out. Let's say you throw that out, which is maybe a big if. He looks awesome. He looks incredible. He looks like maybe the 5th or 6th best analytics profile in the class. But I'm guessing you watched the film and you saw someone who can't separate. So you tell me what the reality of the situation is there.
Yeah, both those players are really interesting guys. So for Johnny Wilson, the problem was, and you see this happen so often, there are guys that can almost get too big. And I think he was one of those guys that just got too big, where he looks like that kid that is a good basketball player. So you ask him to join the football team and play wide receiver for you. And he just doesn't have the right movement skills to be able to get it done effectively. Obviously, he's got a massive catch radius at 6'7". He's a massive player, but a lot of times he wasn't under control as far as his body goes. You want his hands and his feet to be communicating well. Didn't feel like they always were. There were a lot of drops that he had. Some were concentration drops, but there were others that were a little bit concerning. No yards after the catch, no real speed, no real burst. So really you're hoping that he becomes this elite contested catch guy, because that's really the only way that I see him being successful. And even in that, his physicality was meh to me. Like there were times where he played a little more physical, and then there were other times where LSU DBs are just chucking him to the ground. And so it was really inconsistent, the physicality that he played with. Now, going to Keon Coleman, I don't have his score super high. I have him for me, it's a 72, so puts him at like wide receiver 15, 16, something like that. So not super high on Keon Coleman. He's going to be one of the more situational dependent guys for me, because if you're telling me that because he has the body for it, you're telling me that he's going to be your X receiver, I'm out. Like, I'm not interested at all. I don't think he can separate. I don't think his routes are good enough. I'm not in on that. However, if you were to tell me that he's going to play the big slot, okay, now I'm interested, because he's going, that separation and that lack of route running isn't as concerning to me, because you really only need to get one step. And when you're as big as he is, he's going to be able to box out and just find an area and zone and just go up, make plays, make some good catches. So it really depends for Coleman where he lands and how they decide to use him, whether I'm interested or disinterested in Keon Coleman. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. One thing I'll just say about Johnny Wilson is, like, I obviously I'm worried about the floor. I just think it's a little bit higher than we think from a fantasy perspective, just because, like, if a team drafts him as a tight end, like, he would immediately become my tight end 2 in the class. So
for sure,
that's fun for tight end premium. But yeah, everything you said, too big. But maybe that plays better at tight end. Concerns with separation, but that's less important against safeties and linebackers than cornerbacks. But yeah, no, everything you said is what I've heard from all my friends around the industry who have watched the tape.
Yeah, he's a tough one. I want to like him, but there just wasn't quite enough for me there. Well, Scott, this has been an awesome conversation. I think really helpful too, because we do tend to be more film based, and so I love to talk to guys that have more of the production and the analytics and things like that in mind, because it helps balance things out a lot more. And I think anybody that's not doing their best to use all of the different data points, all of the different measurable things and tape and combine, and anybody that's not using as many things as they can as part of their process, I think they're really doing themselves a disservice, because I don't think one of these things all on their own paints a full picture of a player. So really enjoyed having this conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise. This is how front offices do it, where, the bulk of it is film, but you have an analytics guy who mostly just raises questions to see where the disagreements are and why, and what might have caused that, or, hey, did you look into this? Have you thought about that? And I really think that's the right way to go about it, is sort of a marriage between the two.
Absolutely love it. Well, Scott, anything else that you want to touch on or let the people know that you're working on? I know you've done a ton of work leading up to the NFL draft. So anything that you want to let them know about?
Yeah, check out my rookie running back, wide receiver, tight end articles. After the draft, I am going to finalize my rankings, and I'll do my annual post-draft presser review podcast where I basically just sit on that couch behind me and listen to or watch 90 hours of post-draft pressers and just give you the quick hits and the meaningful takeaways from that.
Love it, man. Love it. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning into this episode. Stay locked in. We've got so many more videos coming out. Draft content, looking at these prospects, and looking into the 2024 season. So we appreciate you guys, and we'll see you again next time.